Welcome to our Civil Rights Podcast, where we will be discussing current topics related to civil rights. Today, I have Michael Nicole as a guest, and we will be discussing the BLM riots.
Thank you for this opportunity to be on this show. It's an honor. Now, one topic that I want to bring up that I think is important with today's political compass and climate is if defunding the police is a good idea or not. Now, I just want to hear what you have to say on this, so how about you go?
That is a great topic question, Michael. I can first start off by describing the BLM riots of 2020 and what happened there. So, on May 25th, 2020, there's a man named George Floyd who was killed by a police officer in Minneapolis. During this video, it showed George Floyd repeatedly stating that he could not breathe until he died after 7 minutes of the cop not letting off the back of his neck and cutting off his air supply. So on May 26th, protests or riots, whatever you want to call them, I personally believe they were riots, started, and all 4 officers in the killing were arrested and charged for the death of George Floyd.
That is where the riots started. On May 26th is also when businesses started being looted by protesters. Officers were forced to use rubber bullets and tear gas to keep protesters back as cars and buildings were burned to the ground. On May 28th, the National Guard was even called in to deal with the protests, and then shootings occurred by the protesters. The next day on May 29th, protests started outside the White House, New York City, and Atlantic City, even a bunch of other cities too.
Now that we have a background on the start of these protests, I would say that defunding the police is a bad idea. All around, the idea is just horrible. So according to Axios, when the protests were done and over, nearly $2 billion in damages had been done, and over 19 people died as a result of the riots alone. That doesn't count George Floyd. That's just 19 other separate people, which I believe is just totally unacceptable. So in my mind, how the death of George Floyd was unacceptable, and the police officers should be arrested. They should be charged for the death of him. But how does going out and rioting and causing $200 million in damage and then 19 other people dying, what does that do to help? I don't understand it. Like on the nights I was watching the news and seeing the videos of people looting like Home Depots and Walmarts and carrying out washing machines. How does that help the cause of needing criminal justice reform? How does getting a free washer help that? It boggles my mind. So, and then in the LA riots, which were in the 90s for Rodney King, only $775 million in damages occurred. But how does this defunding the police help this? And according to Terrence Floyd, the brother of George Floyd, told the crowd that to be peaceful. He quote said, "Don't stop blowing things up." So how does these people going out and destroying cities help this at all? I don't understand.
That is a great point. Some do dispute the need for police officers, though. According to the Brookings article on police funding, approximately 38% of murders, 66% of rapes, 70% of robberies, and 47% of aggravated assaults go unsolved every year. There is a case argued about police officers not being useful. Maybe some of that money could be invested in social programs.
The statistics you brought up also proves that there is a need for more police funding. If you cut the funding from the police system even more, then less murders will be solved. If less murders are solved, then there is less police to enforce these laws, and then the crime would significantly skyrocket. Because these people, these criminals, these murderers would know that they could go do anything and just get away with it. They could just be murdering people left and right and get away with it. So, according to Minneapolis records, the city had 405 carjackings in 2020, which is over a 300% increase from the previous year. on January 26th to the 28th, 46 arrests were made in connection to these carjackings, and 69 felony charges were filed with the Minneapolis Police Department. And when police brought down the carjacking ring, like, how would this happen without the police officers being involved? How these operations, which happen all over the country, which terrorize innocent people and communities, ever be solved with just a social worker? They do not have the training or education to be dealing with this sort of thing. They got a handful to deal with on their own. How would a social worker be able to make this situation any better for the citizens of the communities?
That does bring up a good point. Maybe crime among teenagers could be solved with social workers and social programs, and then more funding into police departments could be then used to stop criminal rings and gangs. And then with safer communities, no more gangs would form, as there is no need for gangs to stand up against violence. It seems like riots are a fundamentally bad idea, because all that $2 billion in damages could have been used to improve impoverished communities. Then that could have helped to stop crimes before they even happen. It's really counterproductive for BLM to be rioting for peace when they just use riots and damages and violence.
So I agree that riots are a bad idea. When the Capitol riot happened, $9 million in damage was done and 5 people were killed. This is unacceptable. Anybody on the right, well, most people on the right, 95% would tell you that riots are unacceptable, and this Capitol riot should not have happened, ever. Even President Trump, who they accused of saying that he incited it, he did not. He said in the speech that we will peacefully march to the Capitol. Peacefully, keyword peacefully. But yet he was impeached for this. Because if you have one political side says their party riot was acceptable, while the left said the BLM riots were acceptable because it was social justice, whatever you want to call it, but the right was unacceptable, and even the right will tell you that. No matter who you agree with or what you think, there is no winning until today's political climate. You just can't win. You can't.
Now, that is all we have time for today, but I do thank you for this opportunity to show that, and I will watch civil rights events in the future, and I do think that the Trump protests, as you mentioned before, where they were nothing compared to the BLM riots, and yet the media consistently uses that as the tipping point in American politics and all this other stuff, when in reality, the riots were nothing. The Trump riots were nothing compared to the BLM riots, just the media being disproportional and biased. But thank you for your time.